Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds, the broken genius, haunted by his own invention, reciting a line from the Bhagavad Gita in a 1965 NBC News documentary. Since the end of World War II, historians and artists alike have been fascinated by the brilliant, enigmatic J. Robert Oppenheimer, the theoretical physicist who led the Manhattan Project laboratory that developed the atomic bomb. But Oppenheimer's life was about far more than regret. Kai Bird, co-author of the 2005 Pulitzer Prize-winning biography American Prometheus, The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer, states, he was interesting as the father of the bomb, but the real arc in the story is the tragedy. Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer, which opens in theaters on July 21st, will be the first feature-length film to tackle the scientist's life in its entirety, and it promises to be spectacular. Starring Cillian Murphy of Peaky Blinders, fame in the title role alongside an ensemble-a-list cast, the film will reintroduce the scientist and the top-secret bomb project he hail-made to a new generation of Americans. Oppenheimer provides an opportunity to revisit this charismatic, contradictory man and reconsider how previous attempts to tell his story have succeeded, and failed, at fathoming one of the 20th century's most fascinating public figures. Born into a secular Jewish family in New York City in 1904 and educated at Manhattan's Ethical Culture School, Oppenheimer graduated summa cum laude from Harvard University in just 3 years. By the time World War II broke out in 1939, Oppenheimer had transformed himself into a respected physicist at the University of California, Berkeley. He had also fallen in love with Jean Tatlock, a dues-paying member of the Communist Party who awakened his interest in politics. Oppenheimer's political leanings didn't prevent him from being recruited, in early 1942, for a secret project authorized by President Franklin D. Roosevelt that was drawing scientists from all over the country. 3 years earlier, Albert Einstein had written a letter to Roosevelt warning that breakthroughs in nuclear fission promised extremely powerful bombs of a new type. Now, the race was on to figure out how to build one of these bombs before Germany did. At Los Alamos, Oppenheimer came into his own as a gifted leader. He had a very distinctive voice that was very soft, says Bird. You had to listen very carefully, but he was magnetic. That magnetism kept the lab productive even after an initial design for the bomb, known as Thin Man, had to be scrapped in July 1944. Ultimately, the scientists settled on 2 workable designs for a bomb, which they called Fat Man and Little Boy. At 5:29 a.m. on July 16, 1945, almost 3 years of work culminated in the first nuclear detonation in history. Known as the Trinity Test, it lit the hills of the New Mexico desert. After the test, Oppenheimer was transformed by relief. I'll never forget the way he stepped out of the car, fellow Manhattan Project scientist Isidore Isaac Rabi later said. His walk was like high noon, this kind of strut. He had done it. On August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay dropped Little Boy on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, Boxcar dropped Fat Man on Nagasaki. Estimates of deaths from the 2 bombings vary widely, from a contemporary figure of around 110,000 to a later estimate of closer to 210,000. On August 15, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. In the years immediately following the war, public opinion about the use of the atomic bomb hadn't yet solidified. But perhaps our distance from Oppenheimer's era also presents an opportunity. Nolan's film arrives at a precarious moment in which optimism about nuclear disarmament is giving way to talk of a new nuclear age. Few world leaders today have direct experience with the horrors of nuclear bombs, and some younger people are ignorant of even basic facts about World War II. But perhaps our distance from Oppenheimer's era also presents an opportunity. Before Sherwin's death in 2021, he and Bird read several scripts based on American Prometheus. One, Bird says, was boring. Another was just weird. It had dream sequences, a ghost speaking Oppenheimer's poetry. It had a scene in which Oppenheimer is at a cocktail party in Berkeley and imagines himself dropping a cyanide pill into Edward Teller's drink and watching him collapse on the floor and die in agony. Bird and Sherwin sent back a long memo detailing the script's many historical errors. So Bird was relieved when, in fall 2021, he became one of a handful of people outside the film's production to read Nolan's take on Oppenheimer. "I think it's a fabulous script," Bird says. Unlike other recent depictions, it covers scenes from Oppenheimer's entire life and doesn't shy away from the moral questions of the bomb. Nolan covers in a very deft way the argument among the physicists over whether the bomb was necessary or not, and has Oppenheimer after Hiroshima saying the bomb was used on a virtually already defeated enemy. Bird adds, "People who know nothing about Oppenheimer will go thinking they're going to see a movie about the father of the atomic bomb. Instead, they're going to see this mysterious figure and a deeply mysterious biographical story." Regardless of whether subject matter experts believe there is nothing new to say, the general public's understanding of Oppenheimer and the Manhattan Project hasn't changed significantly since Stimson's 1947 Harper's article. After all, most people's sense of history doesn't come by way of the academy or densely researched biographies. Visiting Los Alamos myself a few years ago, I asked a docent what they thought might renew public interest in the history of the Manhattan Project. The answer? A movie. In the more than 50 years since Oppenheimer's death, popular culture has taken varied approaches to exploring his life. The Peabody Award-winning 1981 documentary The Day After Trinity focused on his regret over his role in building the bomb. The 1980 BBC TV miniseries, Oppenheimer, by contrast, starred a thin, quietly charismatic Sam Waterston and was more interested in the question of Oppenheimer's communist ties and his downfall. Later fictional depictions of Oppenheimer grew less interested in complex readings of his psychology and often flattened him into a character who sometimes bordered on the ridiculous. In 1989, director Roland Joff made a big-budget bet on the story of the Manhattan Project in Fat Man and Little Boy. Despite an A-list cast, Paul Newman as Groves, John Cusack as a fictional Manhattan Project scientist, Laura Dern as that scientist's girlfriend, the film flopped. The script was simplistic, the dialogue groan-inducing, naked. "Isn't that a beautiful word?" Dern says to Cusack when propositioning him, and veracity an afterthought. But the film suffered most from the performance of Dwight Schultz, best known to viewer from The A-Team and Star Trek: The Next Generation, as Oppenheimer. Schultz brought a blankness to his portrayal of a man who famously had charisma to spare. Since Oppenheimer's death, historians have often only exacerbated this problem, labeling him as cold and unfeeling. Oppenheimer was, in fact, a complicated figure. He was a man who was full of feuds and very arrogant, a man who could be very difficult for some people, Bird says. He was not an easy figure, but he was much more than a pure cold warrior. Scholars are perhaps correct that journalists and historians pay too much attention to the bomb and not enough to Oppenheimer. There was, however, a reason for that emphasis. After all, he said, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds."